Welcome to the Anthroposcreen YouTube channel. Today's video will be looking at climate change and societal collapse. In specific, we'll be looking for whatever scientific evidence that we could find that climate change could lead to a societal collapse or downfall, and what kind of impacts and consequences there could be from climate change to humans. The first video I recorded on the Anthroposcreen YouTube channel outlined the ethical philosophy of survivalist utilitarianism. This philosophy mandates that we ought to, in all of our actions, maximize the chances of survival, not just of ourselves and our families and our immediate community, but of society as a whole, where there is any type of threat that threatens human civilization. One of the things I'll be focusing on with this channel is the need to mitigate climate change as much as possible, because I believe that there is a reasonable amount of evidence that climate change could threaten the survival of human civilization. This concern is echoed by a lot of different people who insinuate that climate change is a massive threat to human civilization. The rhetoric that people use is often vaguely apocalyptic. For example, in this Greta Thunberg speech, which is one of the most famous speeches on climate change ever,
our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few.
What sort of scientific evidence is there to justify this strong language? Before we continue, this is a friendly reminder to like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment below, and if you really love my videos, consider joining the Patreon. Jared Diamond is a Pulitzer Prize-winning academic and scientist from UCLA who has a very diverse background in education. In the 2000s, he wrote the book Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, where he focused on how environmental factors contributed to the collapse of several different societies throughout history, including the Greenland Norse, Easter Island, Polynesians of Pitcairn Island, the Anasazi of southwestern North America, and the Maya of Central America. I'd like to take a moment to define collapse as the fall of a complex society, where we see loss of cultural identity, loss of social complexity as an adaptive system, the downfall of the governments that regulate society, and the rise of violence. There are different outcomes of what collapse might entail, including reverting to a more primitive state, being absorbed into a stronger society that might be neighboring the society that collapses, or the society just completely disappears. In the book Collapse, one of the most frightening, but also one of the most relevant examples of a collapse comes out of Easter Island.
Romantic mystery. Why did the Easter Islands erect these great statues, and why, having erected them, did they tear them all down and break them? The answer to that romantic mystery has emerged from archaeological studies of the last 20 years, which show that when Easter was first settled by Europeans, it was not the barren, treeless wasteland that we see today, but it was instead covered by a subtropical forest that included the world's biggest palm tree, now extinct. And so the Polynesian settlers of Easter Island proceeded to chop down trees for the same reason that we do today and that other peoples do. They chop down trees for clearing land for agriculture, and for timber for construction, and for fuel for firewood. and also to make canoes with which to go out to the ocean to harpoon tuna and dolphin that were their main sources of meat and protein. And the Easter Islanders continued chopping down trees until around the year 1680. They chopped down the last tree on the island, at which point they were now out of wood to make the sleds and the levers and to have the rope with which they dragged and transported and erected the giant statues. So from 1680 there were no more statues erected, but without any wood, the islanders could no longer build canoes, so they couldn't go out to sea to harpoon tuna and dolphin. And that meant that for protein, for meat, they turned to the only large animal on the island, namely Homo sapiens. Easter Island society collapsed in a civil war between the 12 clans, that whenever a clan triumphed over another clan, the victorious clan would tear down and break the statues of the defeated clan. And in this epidemic of cannibalism and civil warfare, from those days handed down on Easter Island is the oral memory of the worst insult that an Easter Islander could shriek at another Easter Islander in those days if you wanted to make someone else really furious. What you said to them to drive them out of their mind with rage is, "The flesh of your mother sticks between my teeth."
I read Collapse over 20 years ago, and one of the things that stuck with me over all these years is not just that Easter Island descended into cannibalism, but how scientists think that the Easter Island population did participate in cannibalism. And the way they discovered this is by looking in garbage pits in Easter Island. In their garbage pits, around the time of the collapse, they discovered human bones, which in itself is a strange indication because it's quite disrespectful to throw human body into a garbage pit. Not only that, the bones that they found in the garbage pits had been boiled and broken. And the theory about why they were boiled and broken is that the person who threw the bone in the garbage pit had broken the bones open in order to drink the marrow from the bone, which to me is an absolutely frightening image and has stuck with me all this time. The most important lesson from Jared Diamond's book, though, is that these collapses that occurred through history are also very applicable today.
One might object, well, to draw lessons from the past for the present, that's not fair because there are big differences from the past and present. You can't just extrapolate directly from the past to the present. Yes, that's true. There are differences between the past and present, and you have to take account of those differences if you want to be able to learn from the past, if you want to be able to draw lessons from history. You have to recognize differences between the past and present. Some of those differences make our present situation worse, more dangerous. For example, I mentioned that in the past, societies consisted of relatively few people with weak technology, but today there are 6.5 billion of us with metal tools and bulldozers and nuclear power, not 10,000 Easter Islanders with stone tools. We're hammering away at our environment with much more power and much faster than any past society. That makes our present situation more dangerous than the situation of past societies. Another difference between the past and present is that in the past, societies could collapse one by one. When Easter Island collapsed, Easter Island society collapsed, nobody else in the world knew about it. Nobody was affected by it. And similarly, when the Maya collapsed, it had some reverberations maybe in the Valley of Mexico, but certainly none in the southeastern United States or in the Andes, and none at all in Europe. Nobody knew about it. Nobody was affected by the Maya collapse. But today, thanks to globalization, every society potentially can affect any other society. And that means that the risk we face today is not the risk of an isolated collapse, that's now impossible, but of a global collapse.
Diamond's thesis is that we're currently at risk of a global collapse due to all of the damage that we're doing to the environment. And the reason why Easter Island is one of the more applicable examples of collapse in his book is because Easter Island is very isolated. It's an island in the middle of the ocean, very far away from any other populations or areas of escape. And in a global collapse, if all of the different societies around the world are collapsing at the same time, there's nowhere that we can flee to. And that is the frightening aspect of what a global collapse could be. Next, let's look at what other scientific evidence there is of a global collapse in relation to the climate change that we're expected to see over the coming decades and centuries. The future is something that is very difficult or impossible to predict with absolute certainty. So when we're making predictions about the future, we usually want to think about it in terms of probability. What is the probability of a collapse? Jared Diamond usually answers this in a consistent way in his interviews. For example, in this Freakonomics interview from 2021.
When people, as you asked me, Jared, are you optimistic or pessimistic? I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I see the chances as at least 51% that will have a happy ending and only 49% that will have a sad ending.
Jared Diamond says that there's a 51% chance that things are going to work out well for us, and a 49% chance that things are going to end badly, which in context of his book Collapse means that society will collapse. And I think that this is obviously not a super scientific answer, and I think that most of us have the common sense to interpret it that way. He's essentially just making it out to be a 50-50 probability, and it's clearly a ballpark estimate. He's also making a facetious type of joke almost, where he's saying a 51% chance of civilization surviving is him being an optimist, where for most people, if you would say that there's a 49% chance of the collapse of civilization, that would be a very pessimistic and cynical expectation. What we really need is a scientific analysis, and you could break this down in the same way that scientists are often predicting results of climate change through different outcomes based on the different temperature warming scenarios. So with a 2 degrees Celsius warming, we would expect an X% chance of collapse. With a 3 degrees Celsius warming, we would expect a Y% chance, where X and Y would be different probabilities, like 30 or 60 or whatever. We don't know what those are until we start looking at the science. The first criteria I'd like to establish is that I'm going to be deferring to scientists, and I'd like to outline why. First of all, a scientist is going to be smart enough to get into university. Then they'll take about 4 years to get their undergraduate degree. Sometimes they'll also spend 1 or 2 years in a master's degree. After that, it takes 3 to 7 years to get their PhD in a highly specialized area. And then after all of that, if they're published, then they're going to have a certain number of years in research in their field. They're going to have to be up to date on all of the current peer-reviewed science, and any information that they generate themselves is going to have to be generated through the scientific method, whether they're conducting experiments or building models to predict what's going to happen in the future. Then, after all of that, they're going to endure the peer review process. And the scientists that I'm trying to select information from have to be scientists who specialize in a relevant field to what we're trying to predict. The best information we can use is from peer-reviewed science. This is research conducted by a scientist in a relevant field, and it endures what's called the peer review process before being published in a respected, relevant academic journal.
When an author sends in a manuscript for publication, it usually undergoes a quick screening to make sure it's ready for review. Then the editor-in-chief decides whether the paper is a good fit for the journal. Typically, the editor-in-chief is interested in whether the work fits the scope of the journal, will be interesting to the journal's target audience, and is generally performed at a high level. If it doesn't meet these criteria, the manuscript may be rejected. But if the manuscript seems promising, it's assigned to an editor with subject area expertise, usually an associate editor. This editor also critically evaluates the manuscript, considering the scope, whether the work moves the field forward, and if the results are of high quality. Only if the paper passes this test too does it formally enter peer review. At this point, the associate editor selects scientists with relevant expertise to review the manuscript. Some reviewers may decline the invitation, and it may take several weeks for the completed reviews to come in. Once the editor has enough high-quality reviews in hand, he or she then makes the decision to accept, reject, or request a revised manuscript that addresses the reviewer's concerns.
Even after peer-reviewed science completes the peer review process and is published in an academic journal, after that point, other scientists will be exposed to the information and often will try to either replicate the results in different experiments or models, and some of them might outright try to disprove the results if they disagree with them. And if the scientific results are disproven, then there needs to be either a correction issued in the academic journal or the article could be completely removed. When we consider how much time and energy and expertise goes into becoming a published scientist, and then we consider all the people that review peer-reviewed articles and gatekeep them and make sure that they're up to a high quality, I wanted to talk about climate skepticism. In 2021, there was a review of scientific papers that discussed climate change to see what percentage of those papers expressed any doubt that climate change exists or was caused by humans. They reviewed a sample of 3,000 of these papers that were published since 2012 and found that over 99% of them did not doubt that climate change was a real phenomenon and that it was caused by humans. This is a consensus that's similar to the consensus around the theory of evolution. It's pretty interesting when you think about this and the just incredible level of misinformation that exists with people who say that there's any doubt around climate change at this point, or that they doubt that climate change is caused by humans. And in my opinion, debating people like this is a complete waste of time. The IOP Science review that looked at the consensus around climate change is considered to be a meta-analysis. Basically, they're looking at all the peer-reviewed literature out there and trying to decide if there's any kind of common trends and what can they glean from all that research. And as I'm going through the evidence that climate change may or may not potentially cause a collapse of human civilization, I have organized the evidence in this order shown here, where meta-analysis is the best type of evidence that we could possibly use. The second group would be peer-reviewed science, and the reason why is because if we're looking at individual articles as lay people, we might misinterpret the information that's found there, and a lot of us don't really know what sorts of scientific debates there are at any given moment if we're not experts. So it's easy to look at one peer-reviewed study and maybe be too confident in the results that they're providing. Although peer-reviewed literature is the best information that we have to use, but sometimes there are debates in the scientific community. The third level of quality in descending order would be organization reports. The fourth is scientist opinions, where they sign off on opinions as a group. And then we have scientific opinions that are individual. That is the fifth category. And the sixth category would be other opinions, where I take celebrity scientist opinions and provide them, which is the weakest group in terms of quality of information. When it comes to meta-analysis, you really can't beat the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. This organization has published reports about climate change over the last few decades, and a lot of people consider it to be one of the greatest scientific cooperative efforts ever in the history of humanity. They published enormous reports that are often hundreds of pages long. It's a huge meta-analysis that involves hundreds of authors who review thousands of papers on climate change to try and synthesize the results that they see. When it comes to understanding the potential consequence of collapse of human civilization, the IPCC has never released any statements around that as far as I know. But in the sixth assessment report, Impacts at Adaptation and Vulnerability, published in 2022, that's the most recent information we have about topics that are somewhat adjacent to the idea of collapse. So I pulled this diagram from the report, and the way that it's laid out is that they indicate the confidence levels as from dark purple to white, where dark purple is very high confidence and white is basically no confidence. Also, they indicate whether the impact is adverse or negative on people, or positive and negative means that sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's also a negative impact. And the way to read this chart is I would focus on the global impacts as an overall generalization of how climate change will affect humans, but you can also look at it as broken down by these regional areas. So for water scarcity, they have a medium degree of confidence that we'll see some positive impacts and some negative impacts. For agriculture and crop production, it's medium confidence and negative. Animal, livestock health and productivity, not sure. Fisheries, medium negative. Infectious diseases, medium negative. Heat, malnutrition, and other, high confidence that there's a negative impact. Mental health, high confidence, negative. Displacement, high confidence, and negative impact. This is a big one, especially now. If you look at countries around the world, how they're responding to immigration, their reaction has not been good. And the amount of migration that we're about to see over the coming decades and centuries is leaps and bounds higher than what we're seeing now, which should be concerning. Inland flooding and associated damages, high confidence that there would be negative impact. Flood storm-induced damages in coastal areas, high confidence that it'll be negative impact. Damages to infrastructure, high confidence that it'll be a negative impact. Damages to key economic sectors is a medium confidence that it'll be a negative impact. So there's going to be a lot of stresses on our civilization over the coming decades as a result of climate change. That's something that you can see there's usually high to medium confidence in from the IPCC. A lot of scientific papers separate their analysis according to the warming levels that they expect to see over the coming years, decades, and centuries. So in the sixth assessment report, they have broken down the likely scenarios where the dark blue and the red here are the more likely outcomes. On the y-axis here, you can see the degrees Celsius amount of warming that we expect to see, and then on the x-axis you can see the year indications here. So by the year 2100, the probable outcome is anywhere between, let's say, 1.75 degrees Celsius at the low end and just under 4 degrees Celsius at the high end of warming in terms of the likely range. But it's also possible that we could warm as high as just over 4.5 degrees Celsius, or we could keep the warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius as lower probability outcomes. Another thing to think about is species extinction. We are experiencing and going through the Anthropocene, which is one of the great major extinction events. This was happening before humans really had a significant impact on climate change, but climate change is going to exacerbate this extinction. And the question that scientists have is just how much of an impact is it going to have? So in the report, remember our likely climate change ranges by 2100 is anywhere between, let's say, 2 degrees and 4 degrees Celsius. They put the different outcomes from 2 degrees to 4 degrees Celsius. And on the y-axis here, they have the percentage of species that will be at risk of extinction if we have those warming levels. And all of these little dots are different studies. So this is where you can see a meta-analysis in practice. The results of the studies in terms of how much they predict extinction will occur are all little dots on this chart. So if the warming is as low as 2 degrees Celsius, you might say typically the studies indicate that there's about 10% of species would be at risk of extinction. However, that could potentially be as high as about 18% of species at risk of extinction. If you go to 4 degrees Celsius, then the median percent of species that would go extinct is closer to 10%, but you can see that in the likely range here, in the orange is the likely range, that could go as high as about 30% of species going extinct. If we were to see 5 degrees of warming, they project the probabilities to be as high as over 40% of species extinct as a result of climate change. An interesting thing to consider too is that these warming predictions only project out to the year 2100. So what happens after that? After let's say you're thinking about what is the world going to look like in the year 2200 if we don't figure out a way to stop the warming trends that we're seeing. It's pretty frightening. There are different ways of thinking about species extinction as a moral issue. I think it's an inherently bad thing when we are causing unnatural rates of species extinction. And I say this because it is natural for species to go extinct, but we're causing a rate of extinction that's much higher than what would naturally happen if humans didn't exist on Earth. And I say it's inherently morally wrong because I'm not really using survivalist utilitarianism to justify the morality as being wrong. It's just something that feels inherently wrong intuitively. It's deeply disturbing to watch so many species just disappear off the face of the earth. It's very saddening to lose all that biodiversity. So you could look at it isolated. Another way to look at it is what kind of impact that species extinction and biodiversity has on humans From my understanding, the science around this is that there are unpredictable impacts to humans, and it's very risky when we are causing all these species to go extinct because we need species for our survival. For example, most people understand how bees impact farming because bees help pollinate the different crops that we rely on to survive. As mentioned before, we are going through the Anthropocene extinction event. It's called Anthropocene because it's human caused. It's the first major extinction event caused by any individual species on this planet that we know of. If you are interested in this topic and want to learn more about it, I highly recommend The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, which is a really well-written book on this topic, but it is not easy to intake the information in there just because it's so shocking. The IPCC has not really made any statements or guesses at what the probability of a collapse of civilization would be given all of the stressors that they definitely pointed out in the information I covered. When we look into the peer-reviewed science, I think we'll get a better understanding of why the IPCC makes no mention of collapse. And the reason why is because the science is in its infancy at the moment. Peer-reviewed articles, as I mentioned, are usually great sources of truth, but there's also a risk that there could be a huge debate going on among scientists, and if you cherry pick which articles you pick from, you risk telling only one side of the story. I'm not an expert in this area, and so I don't think it's really appropriate for me to go through each individual article and try and glean details from there. My approach instead is to focus on the meta-analysis and literary reviews that exist in peer review articles, and mostly what I found is that there needs to be more research on this topic. This article, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America, PNAS, titled Climate Endgame: Exploring Catastrophic Climate Change Scenarios, states in the abstract a similar sentiment that we see in most of the articles I'll talk about. They say, could anthropogenic climate change result in worldwide societal collapse or even eventual human extinction? At present, this is a dangerously unexplored topic. Yet, there are ample reasons to suspect that climate change could result in a global catastrophe. The good news, according to this article published in Bioscience, is that climate-related societal collapse articles are starting to uptick, which means that research about the potential worst consequences of climate change is starting to become more common. As you can see here, there's one article every few years before 2010, and then as we move out into 2026, you can see that there's a huge spike in research, especially around 2020. In this article published in Science Direct called Societal Collapse, a Literature Review, which was published in January 2023, basically also acknowledges that there is a decent amount of interest in the possibility that collapse could be caused by climate change in the future, but also notes that there is not much consolidation and synthesis of the research. What was done during this literature review is a review of 361 articles and 73 books. And they had made a future research suggestion looking for modeling into combining climate change with the modeling probabilities of there being a collapse, or the socio-political processes thought to drive collapse. The next category I'm looking at are organization reports. So these are organizations that usually have a mission or have some sort of government influence that are looking into the risks associated with climate change. They could be non-government organizations, NGOs, or security agencies, which I primarily pulled from. And I just pulled a sample of 2 recent publications. Sometimes they build off peer-reviewed science. Sometimes they're largely pulling off their own expertise, as we'll see. So it was a tricky one to categorize because it's this cooperative effort of a lot of usually pretty great minds, but the nature of where their funding comes from means that there could be some huge biases at play. One example I pulled is from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, who published a report titled Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2022. This report does often mention the possibility of a global collapse, but probably because there's not a lot of research on this topic, they don't go into any details of what probability there is of a global collapse being triggered. But as you can see in this diagram, this is just one example. In the upper right corner, global collapse is a possibility if you cross certain planetary boundaries. It's all very vague. There's not too much specifics outlined here. From the same UNDRR report, they reiterate what we saw in the peer-reviewed literature, that the study of this is in what they call primordial state. They talk about how this is difficult. They say, until recently, a lack of data and insufficient computing power have meant it was not practically possible to really see complex networks and to identify the kinds of tipping points that lead to crashes. However, recent advances in systemic risk understanding and computer power are making it possible to assess and understand the structures of underlying networks. I understand that the modeling and prediction of collapse is extremely difficult. So if we're looking at the United Nations IPCC report, they go from emissions projections and models to try and figure out how much climate change there's going to be in the year 2100. And then, based on those possible climate change outcomes, which are difficult to predict, they also try to predict what types of impacts there will be that affect humans. So, as we saw before, they tried to predict what are the likely probabilities of diseases, starvation, and migration, and all other kinds of impacts. All of that's very difficult to do. Then, when you're trying to understand what the probability of collapse is, you have to account for the human behavior part of the equation, which I think is extremely difficult to predict, although I don't really know much of the science behind that. There are certain reactions that humans can have that would fast track the process of collapse. The migration side of things, the rise of certain people in power that we already see. So who could have predicted someone like Donald Trump becoming president of America, for example? There's all these things that could make collapse more and more of a higher probability that are hard to predict. But also, there are human behavior reactions that might work in our favor. So the creation of solutions over the next 80 years or 70 years to help mitigate climate change through emissions reductions, or possibly some sort of carbon capture, or geoengineering projects that reduce the warming. And behind all of these solutions, who knows what we're going to see with the rise of artificial intelligence that could come up with solutions that we would never think of just with normal human ingenuity. The example of Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb book, published in 1968, is a really helpful example to understand all the dynamics of predictions among scientists who are concerned about issues related to the environment and the potential impact on humans. His book in 1968 was about population growth, and he predicted that the population growth was happening so fast that in the 1970s and 1980s, there wouldn't be enough food and resources for people on the planet, and there would be mass starvation and potentially isolated or global societal collapse. What Ehrlich got wrong, definitely, in his prediction is that he didn't account for the Green Revolution, which happened right after, which was a technological advancement in the way that we produce food through agriculture, which helped to prevent a short-term crisis. Another interesting type of organization report that we can look at is intelligence reports from different intelligence agencies throughout the world. The one I would go to as a default, because the military-industrial complex is so enormous in the United States of America, would be the American National Intelligence Council, which oversees, I think, all of their security agencies, including the CIA. In October 21, 2021, they published the National Intelligence Estimate: Climate Change and International Responses, Increasing Challenges to U.S. National Security through 2040. From the first page, they have a blurb that says, "We assess that climate change will increasingly exacerbate risks to U.S. national security interests as the physical impacts increase and geopolitical tensions mount about how to respond to the challenge. Intensifying physical effects will exacerbate geopolitical flashpoints, particularly after 2030, and key countries and regions will face increasing risks of instability and need for humanitarian assistance." In the report, there's also this useful diagram that shows the risk of certain threats, from low and yellow, orange, medium, red, high, and they include the years here: 2021, 2030, and 2040. And some of the more interesting possible consequences include miscalculation over strategic competition in the Arctic leading to conflict is a medium risk. Cross-border water tension and conflict is high risk in 2040. If you're interested in learning more about this in more detail, I would recommend the book Climate Wars by Gwen Dyer, which talks about how this could manifest itself between nuclear powers India and Pakistan. There is cross-border migration attributed to climate impacts is a high risk in 2030 and 2040. Ungoverned unilateral geoengineering is a medium risk. That would be running geoengineering projects without permission from neighboring countries, basically. Strain on energy and food systems is high risk. Negative health consequences is medium risk. Internal insecurity and conflict in the United States is medium risk. Greater demand for aid and humanitarian relief is high risk in 2030 and 2040. And strain on military readiness is medium risk. The next two categories look at scientist opinion. This category is group opinion, and the next category is individual opinion. You could argue that this is a logical fallacy called the appeal to authority, although there is some debate about whether this is indeed a logical fallacy or not. Expert opinion, I think, does have more weight than opinion from just a layperson, and especially if they can point to any scientific literature or research upon which their opinion is based. But generally, a scientist who focuses on climate change or other relevant field is going to have a more relevant opinion than a layperson. Either way, I think the quality of information hierarchy holds. Peer-reviewed science is definitely much better than scientist opinion, and meta-analysis is the best. In 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists released the World Scientists Warning to Humanity. In that warning, they said, "We, the undersigned, senior members of the world scientific community, hereby warn all humanity of what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the Earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated." There were over 1,700 signatories, including 104 out of 193 living Nobel laureates in the sciences at that time. 25 years later, another similar warning was issued, the 2017 World Scientists Warning to Humanity. This one was published in Bioscience and had over 15,000 signatories from the scientific community. The wording referenced the original warning and reiterated a lot of the points. And then in 2019, there was the World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency published in Bioscience, which had over 11,000 signatories. That one said, "Greenhouse gas emissions are still rapidly rising with increasingly damaging effects on the Earth climate. An immense increase of scale in endeavors to conserve our biosphere is needed to avoid untold suffering due to the climate crisis." The journal Nature conducted a survey in 2021 of the living IPCC authors. 92 out of 233 of those authors replied, and one of the questions was, "Do you think you will see catastrophic impacts of climate change in your lifetime?" And 82% of those scientists replied yes. In the same survey, the question was asked, "Do you experience anxiety, grief, or other distress because of concerns over climate change?" 21% yes, frequently, and 40% said yes, but infrequently. 39% replied no. I was able to find some interesting commentary from individual scientists. Two of the scientists who made some relevant comments are both from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. The acronym for this is PIK. It's a climate change think tank that's mostly funded by the German government. The first scientist is Hans Joachim Schellnhuber. This scientist is an IPCC author. He's an atmospheric physicist, climatologist, and founding director of the PIK. He's also one of the authors on the PNAS article that I referenced earlier. He says, "If global warming is not in any way mitigated and we go into a 6 or 8 degree warmer world, then our planet will probably only be able to support 1 billion people." He said this when conducting an interview with the Australian Broadcast Corporation in 2015. Also, Johan Rockström, who is at Stockholm University and teaches water systems and global sustainability, and is also at the University of Potsdam teaching Earth system science, also has experience at PIK as the joint director. currently, and he's author on 2 of the articles that I cited previously. In 2019, he was conducting an interview with The Guardian, and he said, if we had 4 degrees Celsius of warming, it's difficult to see how we could accommodate 8 billion people, or maybe even half of that. There will be a rich minority of people who survive with modern lifestyles, no doubt, but it will be a turbulent, conflict-ridden world. The interesting thing here is we're starting to see predictions of what the surviving population would be. So in the previous estimate, it was said that in a 6 to 8 degree warming world, we'd only be able to sustain 1 billion people. Rockstrom here is saying that in a 4 degree warming world, we would have difficulty supporting even half of 8 billion. So we'd have difficulty supporting just 4 billion people. And this is an interesting approach as an alternative to guessing whether or not society overall is going to collapse. It also insinuates that the lives of billions of people are at risk because of climate change. We also have this presentation from Kevin Anderson, who teaches energy and climate at University of Manchester. He's also former director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. In this presentation, he says, with a 4 degrees Celsius warming, we would see unprecedented social chaos or collapse. Collapse might have been a slip of the tongue, but he also says that there would be economic collapse in that world.
But there's now a small but very real risk that we could hit 4 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Now, the prospects of 3 and 4 degrees centigrade of warming are absolutely dire. I mean, we cannot risk that at all. It is an extreme and unstable climate, far beyond any safe zone that has nurtured our civilization. And we're going to be seeing unprecedented societal and ecological collapse at these sorts of levels. We can see escalating geopolitical instability and rising military tensions. And there will be no real economy to talk about. There's no reduction in GDP. We'll be looking at systemic collapse.
The last category that I decided to include is celebrity scientists, and I found some quotes from some of the most famous scientific educators. Of these that I include, Neil deGrasse Tyson and David Suzuki have a PhD each, and Suzuki also was a practicing scientist before his career in the media. I know this is the weakest category in terms of making a logical argument, but it's probably the strongest category in terms of an emotional reaction. A lot of these people are personalities that people love and trust, including myself.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
I just wanted to add some perspective to what it means when we talk about climate change. Get ready for the new normal. And in most places on Earth, it's not going to be pretty.
By the end of this century, if emissions keep rising, the average temperature on Earth could go up another 4 to 8 degrees. What I'm saying is the planet's on fire. There are a lot of things we could do to put it out. Are any of them free? No, of course not. Nothing's free, you idiots. Grow the up. You're not children anymore. I didn't mind explaining photosynthesis to you when you were 12, but you're adults now, and this is an actual crisis. Got it? Safety glasses off, mother.
From my perspective, David Suzuki is more than just a celebrity scientist. He often speaks in philosophical terms, and without him, my own personal philosophy and ethics would be drastically different than it is today. I'm going to show a clip of David Suzuki speaking recently, but in an iPolitics interview in 2025, he says, "Now it's too late. In regards to climate change, I've never said this before to the media, but it's too late. I'm saying, as an environmentalist, we have failed to shift the narrative, and we are still caught up in the same legal, economic, and political systems. For me, what we've got to do now is hunker down. The units of survival are going to be local communities, so I'm urging local communities to get together. You'll see in the clip that there's a reference to this interview.
Over half of all Nobel Prize winners in 1992 said we human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. And if we don't do something within a decade, we will pass all kinds of tipping points.
Well, but you said to iPolitics in that interview that we all have already passed many significant markers. I mean, is there any going back? Have we missed the point where humans could have made a difference?
We have elevated economics and politics above science.
As I mentioned, I'm a survivalist utilitarian, and utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy, meaning that the results of your actions are more important than the intentions of your actions. When I've done all this research, I'm doing this with an intention that the research can help inform our response to climate change and increase the feeling of urgency that we have towards this issue. I was hoping that having a good idea of the probability of collapse of civilization could help combat the main different forms of climate change denial that we generally see. One of these forms of denial is to say that climate change is not real or that it's not dangerous. Another form of climate change denial at the opposite end of the spectrum is doomerism. People who say that there's nothing that we can do about climate change, so don't bother doing anything. They just fall into a deep state of apathy and denial. If we had a sense of the probability of a collapse of civilization, it would probably combat both of these positions, because it's not going to be 0% probability of a collapse of civilization, and it's also not going to be 100%. And the amount of warming that we see over the coming decades and centuries is almost certainly going to be correlated to the risk of societal collapse. That said, in the process of researching this video, I would say that one of the overwhelming feelings I had was that of frustration. Collapse was a book that was written back in 2005, and it was an international bestseller. Diamond won the Pulitzer Prize. He's a very well-respected academic, and he's a very popular academic. And when he comes out and says that there's about a 50% chance that we could see a collapse of civilization as a result of the way we have destroyed the environment, I would expect there to be more of an academic reaction to this. But as we saw through this video, over the last 20 years, there hasn't been a lot of research into this in any methodological way. Where is the research? I understand that it's difficult, but what possible question could there be that's more important than this one? This has to be one of the great scientific questions of our era. What is the consequences of climate change? And the biggest question is it possible that climate change could end civilization as we know it? It doesn't seem like a rational response to me. The amount of research that has gone into this topic doesn't seem rational, but really none of our reactions to climate change have seemed all that rational over the last 20 and 30 years. I hope that after watching this video, we have a better sense and understanding of what the consequences of climate change are based on current science. So through the IPCC synthesis of the current research, we know that there are high risk of certain stressors that will have an impact on our civilization. We also looked at the increased risk of species extinction. We also saw some of the perspective of relevant climate scientists and other relevant fields. We've seen that they are worried. We've heard them talk about untold suffering and human misery. We've heard them mention that we could be facing catastrophe and chaos. And others, maybe a small subset of them, are comfortable talking about the risk of collapse and the need for more research into what the probabilities of collapse could be and how we can model that out. So after watching this video, I hope people understand that action on climate change is still imperative. We need to try and mitigate this crisis. We know that there's evidence of serious risk, but we also know that there's not really evidence that collapse of society and extinction of our species is not guaranteed 100% yet based on whatever research has been completed. We should still be focusing on mitigating climate change and reducing the amount of warming that we see, because the risks associated with warming get higher and higher the warmer and warmer the planet will get. We also know that we should be focusing on adaptation as well. The last thing that I want to do with this video is contribute to people's climate fatigue. I know that this is an extremely heavy topic, and this video is looking like it's gonna be over an hour long. I can tell you from my perspective that I am mentally and emotionally exhausted because I've been researching this and filming clips and editing for over a week. And so when we are overloading people with all of this information and statistics and science, I think it's important also to try and provide people with an outlet for this climate fatigue that we experience. And so the next video I'm excited to work on is going to talk about a philosophical remedy for climate fatigue. So looking into what the world of philosophy has to try and help people psychologically respond to this overwhelmingly scary information. So make sure to like this video if you appreciated it, subscribe to the channel if you'd like to learn more, and you'll also see that I have a Patreon. So if you think that the material and information that I'm providing is of high quality and you'd like to see more of it, and you have the means, please consider donating to my Patreon. Thank you.